Welcome to the Cabral Concept, where board-certified naturopath and integrative health practitioner Dr. Stephen Cabral shares how he was diagnosed at the age of 17 with a life-altering illness and given no hope for recovery. It was only after studying and traveling all over the world did he discover how to combine ancient Ayurvedic healing practices with state-of-the-art naturopathic and functional medicine to fully rebalance the body and re-energize it with life. It's time to discover how to get well, lose weight, and finally feel alive again. And now, here's your host, Dr. Stephen Cabral.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. We are getting started today on our Total Wellness Tuesday episode, where we will be breaking down what diet is better. Is it low carb? Is it paleo? Or is it keto? So what I'd like to do is break down first the intricacies of what each one of these are, why they should even matter to you, and what the overlap is as well. And then, of course, we'll come full circle. We will, after discussing all three of these, figure out what the best one is for you, especially where you're at right now in your life. So what I always like to do is start with, well, let's go into why someone would want to be looking at different types of diets anyway. And for the most part, when we're looking at low carb, paleo, or keto, many people are doing this for weight loss based reasons, body transformation based reasons, or they're given this by their healthcare practitioner. So the biggest thing to all three of these can be going back to eating whole food. Like, that's a big part of this. However, there is one specific one that is cleaner and healthier than the others, and we'll be getting into that today as well. So let's start right from the top. Let's get into a low-carb-based diet, and I really believe that this first one's going to surprise you. Because if you look at the definition of a low-carb diet, most people would think, well, maybe sub 100 carbohydrates, grams of carbohydrates per day, right? And so, well, let's do even, I think, a little further breakdown from that. So when we look at the macros for the day, your macronutrients, we're looking at protein, we're looking at carbohydrates, and we're looking at fats. And if we want to break this down even a little further, your proteins are going to come from meat or fish or eggs, or it's going to come from more vegan-based sources such as hemp hearts or hummus or beans, legumes, etc., tofu, whatever you would like to do for your protein-based source. And it's simply a food that's food source is predominantly protein-based. Now, some people can say, well, there's protein in broccoli, and I've already broken that down for people as well. Yes, there is protein in broccoli. You'd have to eat somewhere around 40 to 50 cups per day. But yes, there is protein in broccoli, no doubt about it. But we eat our broccoli for a totally different reason, and that's for all of its detoxifying-based benefits from a natural sulforaphane-based standpoint, all of the phytonutrients from all those nice greens, the chlorophyll in it. We eat it for its fiber. So we eat it for other reasons, but we don't eat broccoli for its protein. So what we're looking at now is a low-carb based diet. And a low-carb diet, believe it or not, this is actually the statistics and the science behind a low-carb diet. If you are eating a 2,000 calorie per day diet, and I know, of course, many people are at 1,400 calories a day, some people are at 3,000 calories a day. Just when we look at kind of the RDA standards, we're looking at about a 2,000 calorie diet. That's pretty much what we're going to base things on. So when we look at that, a carbohydrate range, again, we're just going by the US-based guidelines, is going to be 45 to 65% of your total intake would be for carbohydrates in one day. Now, most people they would say that's such a huge amount of carbohydrates. Well, we want to qualify that. So first we want to look at 45 to 65% would be a lot of carbohydrates compared to most diets, but not all diets, and especially a lot of the healthier diets. The problem we run into, and we'll be talking about this on the show here today, is that people eat too many processed-based carbohydrates. But again, we'll come back to that in a moment. So when we look at the calories from 45 to 65% of a total caloric intake of 2,000 for the day, you're going to get about 1,000 of your calories, believe it or not, from carbohydrates, right? That's about 50%. You could get all the way up to 1,300 calories at 65%. And that's because in every gram of carbohydrate, there is 4 calories. So that's going to come out to be about 225 to 325 grams of carbohydrates for the day. Now, most people, they would say that's an enormous amount of carbohydrates. Now, I would say to you that is a large amount of carbohydrates for the average individual that is not exercising a lot or an athlete or anything like that. Because I can tell you that most athletes are eating that many carbohydrates, per day. They're more metabolically active. But I do get it, and I agree that that is too many carbohydrates for the average individual. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. So if we break it down further, because I like to really simplify these things, if you eat 3 times per day, well, you're getting about 75 to about 90 grams of carbs per meal. And again, that's a lot of carbs per meal. Let's say you're eating 4 times per day. Well, now you're at about 60 grams of carbs per meal. Still a pretty good amount, but that would be considered a moderate or normal amount of carbohydrates according to the USDA dietary guidelines, which have been around now for about 5 years. Since about 2015, they switched them over to this year, which is 2020. So, okay, all we needed to do was figure that out because now we know what is technically considered a low-carb diet. And believe it or not, anything below 225 grams of carbohydrates per day based on a 2,000 calorie diet, meaning like it would shrink, the amount would shrink on a 1,400 calorie or 1,500 calorie a day diet, right? If it was 1,500 calories a day, we'd take off 25%. So we would reduce it by about 55 grams of carbs per day. That would take it down on the lowest end at 45% to about 160 or so carbs for the day. Again, a little bit more normal now, right? Because over 4 meals, it's 40 grams of carbs per meal. Over 3, it's about 55 or so. But that is really what's considered lower carb. So now, could it be 50 carbs per day? Yes. Could it be 100 carbs per day? Yes. Could it be 180 carbs per day? Yes. Based on a 2,000 calorie diet, it absolutely could be. So I just want you to know that a low carb diet is not specific. So if you say, I'm on a low-carb diet, now what do most people think? Well, most people think that they're just really eating vegetables, right? I'm on a low-carb diet. And that's what we've come to think of it, but it's not technically correct. Technically correct would be less than 45% of how many calories you eat per day are coming from carbohydrates, right? So, you can always just come up with the calculations yourself. So, again, if you're eating 1,500 calories a day, yours is going to be more like 165 carbs at your highest point. Okay, so I'm not going to give whether I feel it's right or wrong quite yet. I want to bring it together after we look a little bit more at these. So a low-carb diet is anything below 45% of your diet. Okay, and now I know most people believe that it's under 100 grams of carbs per day, or some people believe it's just vegetables, but there's no specific science to say that is true, although it is correct, meaning like there's no one way to do a low carb diet. It's your choice specifically of how many carbs you eat. And again, if it's below 45%, you're on a lower carb diet. Okay, let's go now to the paleo-based diet. Paleo diet is, when I was talking about that in the beginning, the cleanest way of eating. So there are some caveats to that. I want to go through that because a paleo-based diet tries to bring us back to, essentially before 10,000 years ago, if we want to look at it this way. That's when we really started to get more of agriculture. We started to do more maybe farm-based, and we started to cultivate other foods to eat and be able to cook, such as grains and legumes, etc. But well before that, now we're going back a couple hundreds, thousands of years, we could look at that as the Paleolithic-based era. So what we're looking at is saying, there was less disease back then. And again, we're theorizing. We believe that, but we're theorizing. There's less disease back then. And it's not the only reason, but I do agree. People ate a cleaner diet. They moved their body more. 13,000 steps was probably the minimum that people took on average for the day. And I've done a previous podcast on that. So what I would say is this is a great starting point. And as I break it down, you'll see that it's not specifically a diet, but really a way to choose foods. So let's go into that right now. So here's the thing. Paleo diets have been followed by bodybuilders for 100 years, 120 years. Like it's not really new in the fitness-based community. But it became popular more worldwide when Dr. Cordain, Lauren Cordain, actually put out a book. I forget the name of his book now, even though I've read it, a couple of times. I think it was just called The Paleo Diet, believe it or not, and basically popularized it. And since then, there's been many other books written. Rob Wolf, I remember, wrote a nice book on the paleo diet. Mark Sisson's written a book previously on the paleo diet. And that was, for me, that was like 10, 15 years ago reading these books. And again, I was like, well, yeah, this is how I eat, because it started in 1996, 1998, late 90s, I started to get into natural bodybuilding. And these are just the foods that we ate, except for potatoes, which I want to get into for 1 second. So on a paleo diet, what you are eating is essentially foods that you can see in nature that would also have been able to be eaten raw. We'll put it that way. So when we look at these, there's no legumes, there's no beans, there's no lentils. Peanuts would be considered a legume, so that would not be in that category. Actually, cashews then wouldn't be as well. Dairy's not there because you did not have cows that you would go out and milk. That was with the advent of agriculture. There's no whole grains because you just simply you'd be cooking your grains. I think an argument could be made for others, like, for example, oats. People certainly ate oats, just kept them in their mouth, kind of saturated them with saliva and ate them. But again, let's go with the true paleo-based diet. And then there were no regular potatoes. Yams were included, but if you see, I just did some research, not me personally, I just brought some research to light just a couple weeks ago. Let me see if I can find the show for you here as well. And that was on actually the paleo-based diet. I believe it was episode 1582. I don't have that right in front of me, but I believe it was 1582. And what it showed was that we did find about 100,000 plus years ago, ashes of actually Paleolithic people eating potatoes. Regardless, the Paleolithic diet is mainly centered around fruits and vegetables, berries, citrus fruits, squash, yams, and then, of course, you have all of your protein as well, okay? So you can still get plenty of carbohydrates on a paleo-based diet. You have your fish, you can do grass-fed meat if you want, you can do eggs, you've got some non-starchy veggies, and you can still even do nuts and seeds. So all of those are fair game on a paleo-based diet. Now, what you don't have is any refined oils, so it would be hard, right? If you're on a true paleo diet, technically, you would not be using things like olive oil. You wouldn't, or you wouldn't be using coconut oil, or you wouldn't be using grass-fed butter or ghee. So there's some caveats to that, but what you're eating and what's on your plate is really what you can see growing in nature, and that is a nice way to go about things, for the most part. And I would say my diet is 90% paleo. It just simply means I eat things that I can see growing in nature. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but I do use olive oil, occasionally some coconut oil or coconut cream, and then I use some oat flour on the weekends if I'm cooking my gluten-free, dairy-free specialty pancakes and waffles for my family. So that's the paleo-based diet. You can see that it could be high carb, it could be low carb, it could be moderate carb based on the amount of fruit, veggies, yams, squash that you would like to eat. Okay, now let's look at keto, and then we'll pull it together to see kind of what the best diet is for you at this moment in time. So a keto-based diet, again, it's popular right now, but it's not actually new. Bodybuilders have been using the keto diet for many, many decades. I mean, keto diets have been used forever, and they've actually been used in the medical community quite a bit for specific reasons like weight loss, type 2 diabetes. I don't want to confuse that with type 1 diabetes because there's actually ketoacidosis and it can really throw off your insulin levels. So we want to be careful with that, the amount of insulin that you do need. Of course, anytime that you have a health-based condition, you should speak with your medical doctor about switching your diet, especially if it has to do with blood sugar regulation, because drastically reducing or increasing your carbohydrates will drastically reduce or increase your glucose levels in your blood for those people that are susceptible, not for people that are non-susceptible, and we'll talk about that. So the keto diet, though, it really is straightforward. However, like any diet, when it's been out long enough, it gets twisted into something that it's really not. A true keto-based diet does not mean you're taking in endogenous ketones, from specialty supplements and things like that. I'm not against them. So I just want to come out there and say that I'm not against them. But if you put ketones in your body and you show positive for ketones or being in a state of ketosis, it's an artificial ketosis. It's not the same. And I really try to share that with people. True ketosis comes from being in a state of fasting for a prolonged period of time. That's how it was used. And that's the biggest reason as to why we get the most medical-based results from it. Now, the second way to do it from more of a natural-based standpoint would be to make your diet about 70 to 80% fat. Now, again, I want to add a caveat to this. I don't believe that that's healthy in the long run. In the short term, do I think it's an issue? Not really. Do I think it can become an issue after approximately a month or so to 6 weeks? Yes, I do. Because it can actually begin to change the cell membrane structure depending on the fats that you are taking in. It can start to change the gut microbiome. And I've talked about that on previous shows as well. But let's give the positives to it right now. So 70 to 80% of your diet from fat, about 10 to 20% from protein. You have to be careful getting that high in protein, though, because protein will kick you out of the state of ketosis, meaning the amino acids, so basically the building blocks of the protein, can be broken down by your liver and actually a little bit by your kidneys as well through a process called gluconeogenesis. And it does that, and what I'll probably link up maybe some research I can find for you if you want to learn more about how you can actually not be taking in carbs and you can raise glucose levels in your body. And you can do that. I've talked about how caffeine can do it, but again, you have to be susceptible and et cetera, but how really it happens through taking in too much protein. And what your body does is it simply uses three specific things, which is lactate, amino acids, and glycerol, and it can turn those into glucose. One of the pathways is just called lactate dehydrogenase, which is why I test for that on blood work. I really like people, when they go meet with their PCP, I'm like, hey, ask them to add lactase dehydrogenase as well, LDH. And that way there we're able to see, are you going through a higher process of gluconeogenesis, or are you becoming more catabolic? Are you breaking down more muscle tissue, which we certainly don't want? And that can happen when you're in too long of a fasted-based state, or you're not doing ketosis the right way. That's for sure. So you have to be really careful because, again, you can break down your own muscle tissue. You can use the amino acids. Lactate very easily converts over to pyruvate, and you can convert pyruvate to glucose. I don't want to get people lost to the biochemistry here, but just know that your body can do this. So you have to be careful how much protein you take in. And I see people eating these big steaks, and especially grass-fed, on a keto-based diet, and those grass-fed steaks, of course, grass-fed is much better, but they're typically going to be lower in fat, and that's not what you're looking for. I mean, you take down, I see people eating 60, 80 gram protein steaks. You're not going to stay in ketosis. You're probably not. You need a whole lot more fat than that, and that's probably going to be too much protein. And then in terms of carbs, well, a keto-based diet has the least amount of carbohydrates. We're talking about 5 to 10% total of your diet, so it's an extreme low-carb diet. And it's probably not going to be any more than 25 to 50 grams per day of your diet. Again, that would depend on how many calories you take in per day. If you're eating 6,000 calories a day, you could certainly eat a few more carbohydrates. But when you see people saying, oh no, I eat raspberries and fruit and all these things, it's simply not true. I mean, you can maybe eat a cup of raspberries for the day, and then the rest of it would just have to be, green leafy vegetables or other type of veggies. And even at that, you're only getting a couple more cups. So a keto-based diet, besides a carnivore, which I'm not even going to talk about today, I've done a show on the carnivore diet before, is that it is the most restricted in terms of macros. So it's basically completely eliminating carbohydrates, and you get a small amount of protein that you're getting for the day. And I know that some people eat a little bit more protein on it, but again, I would say to you, are you really on a keto diet? And a keto diet means you're in a state of ketosis, because if you're not testing, you're probably not in a state of ketosis. Like, that's the bottom line. A lot of people saying they're doing a keto-based diet, and the truth is they're not. They're on a very low-carb diet, and they're on a very high-fat diet with moderate protein. That's what most people do for a keto-based diet, but it's not getting into a state of ketosis. And I would actually argue that that's one of the least healthy forms of a diet that you could be on. The only thing probably worse could be on a high-fat, high-processed carb diet. That's a recipe for every type of mortality that you could think of, from high cholesterol, or I should say cardiac-based issues, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, basically metabolic syndrome. Not ideal. not ideal at all. So how do we pull this together? Well, when we look at it, believe it or not, when we do our 21-day functional medicine detox, or we do the first phase of our Fatlocity weight loss system, people can get into a state of ketosis. We don't purposely try to get anybody into a state of ketosis. But for the first 21 days, we are doing predominantly vegetables. We're not doing a limit, but we're doing predominantly vegetables as our carbohydrate source. We do that very specifically to help to re-regulate healthy levels of blood sugar, healthy levels of inflammation, healthy levels of hormone, and we're really just trying to recalibrate, reset the body. Now, it's for 21 days maximum. That's what we do it for. Then on Fatlocity, you begin to introduce some berries and fruit. Same for the after the functional medicine detox is over, you're going to more of a nice, healthy maintenance-based plan. So again, are we for it? Well, in the short term, it can absolutely work. The problem is chronic use of the keto-based diet or a very, very low-carb diet can be quite detrimental to many systems of the body in the long term. Now, if you're doing this for medical-based reasons, such as brain cancer, etc., well, that's a different story, and you're going to work with your oncologist and your team on doing a longer-term version of this. But I'm talking about general population. Okay, so now in terms of carbohydrates in general, how many do people need? Well, I've kind of gone through this before. What we do is you really want to figure out what your set point is right now, and it changes over time, especially the more metabolically active you become. So by doing a 21-day functional medicine detox, a 21-day of the first Fatlocity phase, and then easing the carbs back in. I mean, we teach this in IHP. You can do this with an elimination diet. You can do it on any plan you want, but basically we have people go lower carb first. And then what we do is we test their sensitivity to it, meaning we're going to add back in about 25 grams of carbohydrates at a meal. We'll typically do it at breakfast first because we're huge advocates of liquid nutrition for breakfast, easy to digest, a smoothie, get in your protein, get in your healthy fat, get in your carbs, make it easier to digest. Your body's just waking up. It's dehydrated. Again, it just makes a lot of sense from every avenue. You don't want heavy fats and heavy protein first thing in the morning when you're trying to wake up, get the body going. You don't want to then make it sluggish by having to weigh it down with all the energy that's needed for digestion. So super simple, and it actually works better than just fasting till noon because now you have fuel in your body. You can still fast overnight. I mean, we're big advocates, again, of 12 hours, 14 hours for most people, 12 to 14. 16 doesn't work for your typical person who's, getting now into their late 30s, 40s and beyond. They've got a busy life. They've got kids. They've got a family. They don't necessarily get their 8 hours of sleep a night. So again, we're always working for the individual. But what I say is really any of these can be used, but the truth is the truth. And when you look at it, you want a paleo style diet that's not overly high in carbohydrates. And then what does it all come back to? And if you've been listening to the Cabral concept for some time, you know that if you are unbiased and you really look at the healthiest diet, it keeps coming back to the Mediterranean style diet. Now, there are other elements you can add into it, but the Mediterranean style diet, maybe adding in some of the oatmeal in the morning if you want, especially it can help with a lot of glucose, blood pressure, cholesterol-based issues. Again, you can look it up. You could add that in. You don't have to do it. You can be on a strictly paleo-based diet, but the Mediterranean diet, for the most part, if you take out the breads, because you don't need to add those are added later basically, you can be on a really nice, healthy diet. You can still get in your low glycemic fruit. You can add in your protein. You can get it from vegan-based sources, or you can get it from fish, which are high in omegas. So what I want people to do is you can start off lower carb, and I know many people will, and I'm not against that. But what I eventually want you to do is come back closer to center. So that means that you will most likely come back to somewhere between, let's say, 75 and 150 grams of carbohydrates per day. More if you're more active, not really less if you're less active. The 75 that's pretty low. That's about 25 grams at each meal of the day. And believe it or not, that could be predominantly just the 7 to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables that I talk about, right? So if you're getting in 1 to 2 cups of berries a day, well, you're at about 50, and you could spread that out if you wanted to. But the other thing is you can just get the rest from vegetables, and you never need to eat your starchy vegetables if you don't want to, such as your yams and squash, etc. So for most people, you're going to find the sweet spot to be, believe it or not, in terms of the RDA guidelines, a lower carb diet. Most people will be pretty good around 75 to 150 grams of carbs per day. Again, if you're more of the ectomorph, you're going to need more carbohydrates. That's just the way that it is. And then if you're the endomorph, you'll be down towards the lower range, maybe 75 to 100. Your protein for most people, about 20% or so, 15, 20%. And then your fat is going to make up the difference. And again, for most people around there, maybe around 30% or 40% or so from a healthy fat, such as olive oil, avocado, or olives if you want, nuts, etc. Now, again, there are caveats to all this. I've talked about the ApoE genotypes being a 4. You probably go lower fat, especially saturated fats, not necessarily super low. But these are all things to consider. I just want to give you general guidelines for today. You can always work this out with your health coach or practitioner, nutritionist, etc. So hopefully this was helpful. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you. And as always, if it was helpful, please do feel free to share this show with anyone you believe it could serve. Did you know that the body really only becomes sick or imbalanced in only 2 ways? Over time, you become deficient in vital nutrients, and you also accumulate toxins internally and from the environment. As those nutrients diminish and you increase your total toxic load, your body then begins to show the first signs of dis-ease. It's actually quite predictable, and the good news is that if we know how you began to fill up that proverbial rain barrel, we also know how to empty it to begin the healing process. I was fortunate enough to learn this ancient healing process from my mentor after suffering from debilitating diseases for close to a decade. It was only when I began to implement these techniques did I finally overcome my illnesses and go on to live a life of energy and vitality that I now enjoy. I'd like to share with you now what I discovered after traveling all over the world and how to combine the best of ancient healing wisdom with state-of-the-art science. Allow me to teach you exactly how I've been able to help over 250,000 people to empty their rain barrel and begin to transform their body and lives into what they've always hoped they could be. To get your copy of the international bestseller, The Rain Barrel Effect, simply go to StephenCabral.com/rainbarrel.